Hello and welcome to review number 5. This review is called Sectionalism and it is the 5th review for our AP exam. Okay, we start off with immigration in the 1840s. How is it different than before? Remember, the original immigrants and up until the early 1800s is almost entirely English. Now we do have a smattering of other countries as well, but for the most part it's going to be English. After the 1840s, and from the 1840s until just after the Civil War, we're going to see most of our immigrants coming from Ireland and from Germany. The Irish immigrants are going to be desperately poor for the most part, and the German immigrants are going to be a little bit wealthier, and they are going to actually be able to move inland because they have the money to move to places like Minnesota and Wisconsin, still heavily influenced by that German culture today. Southern immigration, why not? Ships didn't go there. There's no need for immigrant labor in the South. It's almost entirely cash crops and farming. And for the most part, these European immigrants don't like the idea of slavery. Irish in the cities, what effect does it have? Cities grow exponentially. There's overcrowding in the cities. We see lots of poverty in the cities, and it also keeps wages low as early as 1840s, 1850s, and certainly we're going to see that as we get past the Civil War into the 1870s and 1880s. Nativism. Now remember, we are not talking here about Native Americans. We are talking about people who feel like that they are native to America. These Europeans who say, hey, we were here first, and these immigrants are ruining everything. So nativism, basically they are called WASPs, White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. They believe America for Americans, and we should keep all these immigrants out of America. These people are anti-Catholic, mainly because of their Puritan influence, especially in the Northeast. They're afraid that the Pope is going to take over. And so we again see this issue of Catholicism versus Protestantism, and it's spilling over into the Americas. The Know-Nothings. Why did the Know-Nothings come into prominence? The Know-Nothing Party is not really a party at first. It's a collection of people, a large collection of people who are anti-immigrant. And when people ask them, hey, are you part of that Know-Nothing Party? Do you know anything about that Know-Nothing Party? Or that group of people that don't want immigrants to come in, they say, I know nothing. Eventually, the Know-Nothing Party is going to become an official American political party called the American Party, and then it's this American Party that makes up part of the Republican Party just before the Civil War. Manifest Destiny. Manifest Destiny means we are destined by God to do something. In this case, God likes what we're doing so much in America that He has destined us to take over all the land from the East Coast to the West Coast. This was initially coined by a guy named John O'Sullivan, a New York newspaper editor, in 1845. And so again, we're going to take over all the land from East Coast to West Coast. And then once we hit the West Coast in the 1850s, and then we make it through the Civil War, Manifest Destiny is not going to stop at the West Coast. We are going to continue with Manifest Destiny into the South Pacific, into the Caribbean, and we'll talk about that later. Why are people encouraged to go west, or why do they want to go west? Economic opportunities. There's land out west, there's no land in the east, and so people are looking to get that land. And again, land is everything for these Americans, and land is everything for these new immigrants as they're coming into America. Because remember, in Europe, there's very little chance, if any chance at all, to get land in Europe. So a lot of these people are coming over to America for the hope and the promise of being able to get some land that they can call their own. Negative reasons for and effects of Manifest Destiny. Well, as we move further and further west, we are pushing Indians further and further west. And so we are constantly seeing the struggle between whites and Native Americans as we're moving into the Great Plains and as we're moving into the far west of the the Colorado Mountains. Also, California Hispanics are going to take a hit here as we move into California, especially after 1849, the gold rush. There are a number of Hispanics living in California that are going to have a hard time as well. The settlement of Texas. Why did Americans move to Texas? Remember, Texas was part of Mexico. In fact, it's called the state of Coahuila, Texas. And Americans are moving down there for a couple of reasons. First of all, with the promise of land, but secondly, after the Panic of 1819, people are in debt and they're running away from their creditors, and so they're moving down into Texas. Now, Mexico is encouraging this initially because there's hardly anybody living in Texas, and it's a way to be able to get some tax money from this previously not unclaimed land, but land that's pretty much open, that nobody's living there. So they're encouraging people to move there. They're encouraging people to grow cotton. If you grow cotton, you're going to make money. If you make money, then you can pay taxes to the Mexican government. The Texas Revolution. They declare their independence in 1835. They actually fight the war for independence in 1836. A couple big names here. Well, first of all, Stephen Austin is one of these people who moves 200 families into Texas, and that's, of course, before 1836. The main figure in 1836, though, is a guy named Sam Houston. He is the first president of Texas, and he leads the revolution in Texas. Two big places here, the Battle of San Juanito, sorry about that, and the Alamo. The first battle is the Battle of Alamo, where the Texas defenders at the Alamo hold up the Mexican army for almost two weeks, giving Sam Houston enough time to form an army, to train an army, and to then win the second battle of, and I'm going to screw it up again, the Battle of San Juanito. The Texas timeline starts in 1835 to 1836 as the Texas declares its independence and the Texas Revolution. 1836 to 1845, those 9 years, Texas is its own independent country, and thus the Lone Star Republic. 1845, Texas was annexed by President Tyler. But Tyler it's not finalized until Polk comes into office. So Polk comes in, and Texas is officially now part of the United States. 1846 to 1848 is the Mexican War. Now, a lot of people confuse the Texas independence with the Mexican War, or they want to put the Texas independence with the Mexican War. They are two separate events. The Mexican War has very little to do with Texas and Texas independence. Okay, why don't we want to annex Texas? Or why did some people not want to annex Texas? Because it's going to be another slave state. And in fact, Texas is so large, the concern for Northerners is if we allow Texas to become a state, then it could be divided possibly up into four or even 5 different slave states. The election of 1844, why is that important? President Polk comes in, and James K. Polk comes in. He is a dark horse candidate, meaning at the convention, nobody had really been talking about James Polk as a contender, as a possible candidate for president. Once we get to the convention, he winds up as the candidate for the Democrats, and he winds up, of course, as president of the United States. Mainly on his platform of an expansionist. He's already looking at the Oregon Territory, he's looking at possibly California, and so he's looking to expand the United States. What did Polk do? The Oregon Territory and the Southwest because of the Mexican War. We'll talk about the Mexican War here in just a second. How did he support Manifest Destiny? By acquiring land. So all of this western land that Polk gets is in support of Manifest Destiny. Quote regarding acquiring California. A senator, a guy named Thomas Benton, who is the father of a woman named Jessie Benton, who is the wife of John C. Fremont, who we know here in Nevada. Anyway, Thomas Benton says, if we don't take this land, someone else will. And the concern is, if we don't take this western land, especially Oregon, but also to a lesser extent the southwest part of what we know today as the United States, Britain will come in and they will control this area and possibly carve out a country for themselves or carve out a colony for themselves. And this quote would be just before the Mexican War. One of the reasons why we get into the Mexican War is to control this land. The Oregon Territory consists of Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. The United States and Britain shared this territory all the way up into the 54th degree 40-minute parallel, which is way into Canada today. The United States told Britain that we are going to take over all this land, or you can fight us over it. And there's going to be a negotiation between Britain and the United States. Britain did not want to give up any of this land, and so under President Polk, the citizens of that time are starting to say, listen, either we take all the land up to 5440, or we will fight Britain for it. Remember, we have already beaten Britain twice in wars, the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. So Americans are feeling pretty confident that we can do it again. Well, negotiations take place, and the dividing line, the border between Canada and the United States in the Oregon Territory, is the 49th parallel, which is important for the United States because the United States gets the Puget Sound. The Puget Sound, let's see if I can do this, the Puget Sound is right in there, and it's a very important it's a very important bay where we can stop our ships, and it's a very important port for America, is what I'm trying to say. Okay, the Mexican War. The causes of the Mexican War, starting in 1846 and going into 1848, is partially because we annexed Texas. Now, Mexico is still not real thrilled about America annexing Texas, and so this is a small part of why Mexico and the United States goes to war. There's also a border dispute that we kind of construct, and we blame Mexico for attacking Americans in what we call United States land. This is right around the Rio Grande border. And so because of this, the Mexican War starts. It lasts for about 18 months, and the United States gains a lot of land from Mexico. We gain essentially the southwest part of the United States, most of Arizona, most of New Mexico, or all of New Mexico, California, Nevada, part of Colorado, part of Wyoming. There's a little slice of Wyoming in there. I think I said Nevada. And so, and Utah. And so the United States gains what we know today as the southwest part of the United States. The Wilmot Proviso, this is done by David Wilmot. He's a senator from Pennsylvania. And now the concern is, we have all this land. Is it going to be slave land? Is it going to be free land? And so David Wilmot, again, and this gets into sectionalism again, David Wilmot proposes that any new land gained from the Mexican War should be free. Now, it passes the House several times, but it never passes the Senate. So again, this argument about slavery, should land be slave, should land be free, is out there again. Ralph Waldo Emerson was against the Mexican War. He said the Mexican War will poison us. Basically, we're gaining all this land, and again, we will be fighting over should it be free, should it be slave, and he is afraid that there will be more slave land. He considers slavery immoral. Compromise of 1850. Compromise of 1850 is right after the year 1849, and that sounds a little funny, but 1849, of course, is important because of the gold rush. And in that 1 year alone, we have over 50,000 people moving to California. Because of that, now we have a population of over 60,000 in California, which means California can apply to be a state. So again, will it be a free state or will it be a slave state? Well, most of the people in California are against slavery. They see no reason for slaves, and so it's going to be a free state. So how do we balance that out now between the North and the South? The North is going to have one more free state than the South is going to have slave states. Well, Henry Clay comes up with his third compromise. This compromise, again, is going to save the Union, and this time it's going to save the Union for another 10 years until we hit 1860 in the Civil War. This is called Clay's Omnibus Bill. An omnibus bill is a collection of bills all put together. So there are 6 parts to this, 3 for the South, 3 for the North. Let's take a look at the South first. The South gets a stronger Fugitive Slave Act. There had already been a Fugitive Slave Act, but this one says that the federal government is responsible for catching and returning runaway slaves. So now the federal government is responsible for going into the North and finding runaway slaves and returning those slaves into the South. Now remember, the Northern response to this are personal liberty laws. Personal liberty laws did not allow for state jails to hold runaway slaves, and so it was very difficult because these slaves are going to be trying to avoid capture by the federal government. So this is the big one for the South, but even though it's a big one for the South, it's not as big as gaining a whole state in California. All right. Secondly, the South slavery is still allowed in Washington, D.C., although the slave trade is going to be abolished in Washington, D.C. So slavery is still allowed in the nation's capital. The South also is going to get this idea that Congress is going to deny jurisdiction over the interstate slave trade. So that's going to be opened up between the states. Congress is not going to say anything about it between different states. Okay, what did the North get? The North, obviously, first of all, gets California. California comes in as a free state, undoing the balance between the North and the South. Also, in the New Mexico and Utah territory that we gained from the Mexican War, there's going to be popular sovereignty. Now, popular sovereignty means that the people of those areas can decide whether or not to be slave or to be free. Now, it sounds like this is a benefit for both sides. There's an equal chance for the North and the South to get what they want. In reality, though, there's no need for slaves in the Utah territory, and there's no need for slaves in the in the New Mexico territory. So those areas are going to be free. And then there's a border dispute between Texas and New Mexico. Texas wanted that land, their border, to be much further west of where it's at now. Let's see if I can do this on the map. Okay, there we are. Texas wanted that land all the way over to here, and New Mexico, of course, wanted to push that further east. Well, that border dispute is going to be won by New Mexico, so the North gets actually a little bit more free territory with New Mexico gaining that land. The omnibus bill is created created a stringent fugitive slave law. We've already talked about that. Map of Compromise of 1850. Okay, if you see a map of only Missouri, it has to be after 1820, but before 1850. If you see a map that has both Missouri and California as a state, you know that map must be after 1850. Map of the Compromise of 1850, California is shown as a free state. Personal liberty laws, we've already touched on this. This is a response to the new Fugitive Slave Act, where the federal government can come in and grab those slaves. Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852, written by Harry Beecher Stowe. Now, this is important because it is a bestseller in the North. Now, Northerners knew that slavery existed. They knew that slavery is bad, but they never really had a good picture of what slavery was like. And so, all of a sudden, in 1852, Northerners have a very clear vision of what slavery looks like in the South. And because of this book, many Northerners who had not thought about slavery for a long time, or many Northerners who were kind of on the fence, these Northerners are now going to be, maybe not abolitionists, but they are going to be anti-slavery. Popular sovereignty, we've already touched on this. The people decide in a territory whether or not to be free or a slave. The Freeport Doctrine comes from the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Lincoln-Douglas debates are basically debates in Illinois about slavery, whether or not we should or should not have slavery. And the Freeport Doctrine says that popular sovereignty should always decide on slavery. The Kansas-Nebraska Act is a very, very complicated story, and it really is one of those things that leads directly to the Civil War. Kansas-Nebraska Act is actually passed in 1854, and it repeals the Missouri Compromise. Remember what the situation was here. Stephen Douglas from Illinois wants two things. He wants, first of all, a transcontinental railroad, a railroad that goes from California all the way to Illinois, where then it would branch off into other railroads. He wants that railroad to go through Illinois. He wants it to go through Chicago. But he also wants to become president. And in order for that railroad to happen, you need to be able to survey that land out there. And the only way to survey that land is if those territories can become states. And so he needs Kansas and Nebraska to become states. Well, if Kansas and Nebraska become states, that will impede what he wants secondly. He also wants to become president. If Kansas and Nebraska become states, they are going to be free states because of the Missouri Compromise. Remember, anything north of 3630, the southern border, let's try this again, the southern border and anything in the Louisiana Territory is going to be free. And certainly Kansas and Nebraska both fit that bill. So the question is, how do we get Kansas and Nebraska into the country without the entire South hating Stephen Douglas? So, because if the entire South hates Stephen Douglas, they're not going to vote for him for president. Well, Kansas and Nebraska Act is going to overturn the Missouri Compromise and declare that Kansas and Nebraska will have popular sovereignty. The people in those states will be able to decide. This is not such a big deal in Nebraska because there's no real need for slaves in Nebraska. But Kansas being right next to Missouri, that's going to be a bigger deal because people in Missouri, people in the South are going to flood into Kansas and try to make Kansas a slave state. The Lecompton crisis, remember in Kansas now, starting in 1857, we actually have two capitals in Kansas. We have one in Lecompton, which is going to be a pro-slavery capital, and one in Topeka, which is going to be an anti-slavery capital. Because of this, starting in 1857, and because of popular sovereignty, we have people flooding in from Missouri, we have people flooding in from places as far away as Massachusetts, all of which are hoping to vote whether pro or anti-slavery. Many people, especially from Missouri, are voting illegally in this election, and the issue is never really decided before the Civil War happened, or before the Civil War starts. Kansas is actually going to wind up as a free state because it enters during the Civil War. But it leads to lots of killing. Over 200 people are killed in what's known as Bleeding Kansas. The Dred Scott case, remember Dred Scott was a slave. His owner started in Missouri, moved his family, including Dred Scott, to Illinois, and then eventually moved back down to Missouri again. When the owner of Dred Scott died, Dred Scott sued for his freedom, and actually it went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court decided that Dred Scott was not a citizen, that slaves were not citizens, that blacks were not citizens. And because blacks are not citizens, they have no right to bring these cases in front of court. What this is essentially saying is that slaves are property. They are not people. And so the Fifth Amendment, because the Fifth Amendment protects property, this means that slave owners can move their slaves, can move their property anywhere in the country, which essentially means that the entire country is now open to slavery. The Austin Manifesto in the 1850s, this is the Southern attempt to purchase or take over by force Cuba from Spain. And the idea is if we take over Cuba, we can create that as a slave state, and it would be more slave territory for the South. 1850s sectionalism debate. What were some of the issues? Who decides on slavery? Does the federal government decide on slavery, or do state governments decide on slavery? Also, tariffs. Tariffs are still a big deal. The North, of course, wants higher tariffs. The South, of course, wants lower tariffs. And so this is a big issue coming into the Civil War. States' rights. This idea of who should have the final say in what goes on in states. The South really wants these states to have almost complete control over what happens in these states. The North says that the federal government is the overriding decision maker on what happens in these different states. And then internal improvements. The American system set up by Henry Clay. The South does not want taxes to go toward internal improvements. Of course, the North does, because the North is going to expand more, using more roads, using more railroads, using more canals, and a lot of that tax money is going to be used to expand those different things. The South hardly gets any of that, so they don't want their tax money to be used for those different things. John Brown. John Brown is an abolitionist. His life goal is to see slavery abolished, and he winds up becoming a martyr for the cause. There are two different situations here. One in Potawatomi Creek in Kansas. This is really during the summer of Bleeding Summer, 1856. John Brown kills 5 pro-slavery people in Potawatomi Creek. Now, none of these people actually owned slaves. They were just pro-slavery. This actually starts Bleeding Kansas, which goes for another year into 1857. John Brown escapes to Massachusetts and lives there for about 3 years. During those 3 years, abolitionists in Boston, including the father of Harriet Beecher Stowe, finance John Brown, give him guns, which are called Beecher's Bibles, and because remember, Edward Beecher, Harriet Beecher Stowe's father, is a minister, and so Edward Beecher gives John Brown a bunch of guns and sends him down into Virginia. The plan is to take over Harper's Ferry in Virginia, and Harper's Ferry is in the mountains, and the goal is to attack a federal arsenal there, get the guns, and then encourage slaves to run away to a hideout, to a fort in Harper's Ferry, in the mountains of Harper's Ferry. Well, he goes down to Harper's Ferry. He's captured while trying to take these guns. He's put on trial, and he is tried for treason, and he is eventually hanged. The North sees him as a martyr. The South, of course, sees him as some crazy guy. But it freaks out the South because if John Brown, this crazy guy, does this, what happens if there are more attempts to do this? The Republican platform in 1860. Now remember, the Republican political party is made up of a couple different newer political parties. First of all, the American Party, which evolves from the Know Nothing group, and then the Northern Democrats, who are Democrats. These are really poor people, but they are anti-slavery. And so these two groups formed the Republican Party in 1860. The party platform said no extension of slavery. Now remember, they're not trying to abolish slavery. They are just trying to contain slavery or trying to stop slavery. The Homestead Act offered very cheap land to encourage people to move out to places like Nebraska and Kansas and Minnesota and Iowa. Of course, as we get more people out there, that land is going to be inhabited by pro or anti-slavery people, which means those areas are going to be free states. The South hates this idea of a Homestead Act. And then a transcontinental railroad that would go through the North. That would go from Sacramento in Northern California to essentially Chicago. Republican Party founded on the principle of what regarding slavery? No expansion. Remember, the Republican Party, the early Republican Party, is not about abolishing slavery. They want to contain slavery. They want to stop slavery from spreading, but they don't want it, and they don't want it to spread. The candidates of the 1860 election. Abraham Lincoln, he's the Republican candidate. He wants to keep the Union together at all costs, and he wants to contain slavery. Even Abraham Lincoln is not an abolitionist. It's not until during the Civil War where he starts talking about abolishing slavery. Stephen Douglas, he's a Northern Democrat. He is for popular sovereignty in all these different territories. He says a vote for Lincoln is a vote for secession. Same thing with John Breckinridge. He's a Southern Democrat. Now, Southern Democrats are Democrats that support slavery. Again, and John Breckinridge says a vote for Lincoln is also a vote for secession. And then John Bell, a constitutional Union candidate, a new political party, he will do anything to save the Union, including protecting slavery forever. Lincoln wins the popular vote with under 40%, but he wins a landslide in the Electoral College. So he wins without any Southern support. But because most of the major cities and most of the electoral votes are in the North, Lincoln winds up winning. Lincoln's policy on slavery until in 1860, no expansion, just contain it. The effect of Lincoln's election, as soon as Lincoln takes the oath of office, South Carolina secedes. This is actually, as soon as he becomes president, is elected, South Carolina secedes. This is December of 1860. Lincoln is elected without what? Any Southern electoral votes. The Crittenden Compromise. John Crittenden is a senator from Kentucky. In fact, he is actually sitting in Henry Clay's seat, the great compromiser. And he feels some pressure to come up with a compromise to save the Union. And so the Crittenden Compromise proposes that we restore the Missouri Compromise, that we have a national slave code, that we repeal all personal liberty laws, and we guarantee slavery forever, an unamendable amendment. So if this happened, we would still have slavery today. We would have this amendment that could not be amended, much like Prohibition was amended. First we have it, and then it's overturned. Why did the South secede? Failure of the Missouri Compromise, the Dred Scott case. The answer here, of course, is the election of Lincoln. Why did the South attack Fort Sumter? Fort Sumter was a federal fort in South Carolina, and it is, so South Carolina is going to be the first state to secede, and it is the first place where the South sees a major threat in its own state. The South thought it would win because the South had better officers. If you take a look at Robert E. Lee, the South has one commander through the entire war. And his generals underneath him are also that good. Most of these people are from West Point. They are highly trained, and most of these people are following their states in the Civil War. And so the North is left with sub-rate generals or second-rate generals, and we see this because Lincoln goes through general after general after general before coming across General Grant and General Sherman. They also believed that because they were better outdoorsmen, that they would be able to survive longer camping, and they knew the backwoods better than the North. They knew that the North is going to have to take over the South. The South does not have to actually invade the North. All they have to do is hang on. And so their strategy is really going to be the same strategy that the Americans had during the Revolutionary War. Just hang on. The South believed that the North would not tolerate a long, bloody war, that the North would sue for peace, and then they would just let the South go. And then they also believed that the British would help them. Remember, the British is a very they're dependent upon cotton because of their textile industry. And if that supply of cotton is stopped because of this war, Britain is going to come in on the side of the South. That almost happens with the Battle of Gettysburg. The South almost wins the Battle of Gettysburg, this major battle. If the South would have done that, there's every indication that Britain would have come in on the side of the South. Why did the North go to war with the South? To keep the Union together. Order of political events of the Civil War. First of all, April 61, one of the first things that Lincoln does is he suspends the writs of habeas corpus. What this means is that the federal government can detain you and actually hold you in prison without even charging you with a crime. 1862, the Homestead Act is passed, which encourages people to move out west, which of course means as those areas become more populated, they have the ability to become states. And most of them are going to, well, all of them are going to be free states. The Pacific Railway Act, 1862. This is the act that allows for the Transcontinental Railroad to be built. 1862, the midterm elections with no South, so the Republicans are essentially going to take over all the Senate and all the House of Representatives, and with very, very few Democratic voices, and so none of the southern states are going to be in Congress. And then blacks start serving in the Northern military in right around end of 1862, 1863. Now, initially, blacks serve as just menial labor kind of jobs. They are cooks, they are digging trenches, they are digging graves, but eventually they are allowed to fight. King Cotton's role in the Civil War. Again, the South thought that because of cotton, Britain would join the South during the Civil War. That almost happens, but it doesn't. The Northern efforts to keep the South from the war. The Crittenden Compromise, we've already talked about, which did not happen by late 1863. The events, Vicksburg, Gettysburg, Emancipation Proclamation, or Appomattox. It's very important that you know Appomattox. Appomattox Courthouse is where the war ends. This is where the ceasefire is signed, and it happens in 1865, April of 1865. The Emancipation Proclamation. Emancipation Proclamation happens in 1862. This is right after the first major victory for the North. Lincoln was waiting for a major victory, and it happens at Appomattox. I'm sorry, it happens at Antietam, not Appomattox, 1862. Antietam is the bloodiest battle of the Civil War, the bloodiest single day of battle of the Civil War, and like I said, the North wins. Because of this battle, Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation, and what it says is that all slaves in states in rebellion against the United States are now free, which means these border states, states like Kentucky and Maryland, they will be able to keep their states because they are border states. The only way those slaves are going to be free is when we pass an amendment after the Civil War. And so it only freed those slaves in states in rebellion. The reason why he's not freeing all the slaves is because if he frees the slaves in Kentucky, then Kentucky is going to join the war with the South, and Lincoln cannot let that happen. Who did it affect? States still in rebellion. We've already talked about that. Gettysburg. Gettysburg is probably the single most important battle of the war. It happens almost right in the middle of the war, July 1st, 2nd, 3rd of 1863. The South invades the North for one of only 2 times that it invades the North, and is the last time that the South invades the North. Before Gettysburg, the North hardly wins any battles. After Gettysburg, the North hardly loses any battles. And if the South would have won Gettysburg, we've said this now a couple times, there's every indication that Britain would have come in on the side of the South, making it much more difficult for the North to win the Civil War. Because of Gettysburg and because of so many people being killed at Gettysburg, a year later there's a national cemetery at Gettysburg, and this is where Lincoln goes and gives his Gettysburg address. The importance of Vicksburg. By taking Vicksburg, it allows the North to control the entire Mississippi River, and if you remember that Anaconda plan, that planned by the North to strangle the South, and this is just another way that the North is strangling the South from now west to east. Sherman's march to the sea. He starts in Tennessee. He makes his way to Atlanta. He burns Atlanta to the ground, and then for 200 miles from Atlanta to the ocean, to the Atlantic Ocean, he destroys everything in his path. It's called total war, and he is leaving the South with nothing. The idea is to break the back, to break the spirit, to break the morale of the South. Even today, William Tecumseh Sherman is not seen highly by the South. Even today, Southerners say that Sherman went way too far in what he did. Effects of the Civil War. Of course, the major effect of the Civil War is that it ends slavery. But also, this is the last time where there's a threat of secession, a serious threat of secession. And so now we come out of the Civil War as a united country. Before the Civil War, there was this question of who has the power. Do the states have the power? Does the federal government have the power? And that issue is solved again. So even today, the federal government has clear power over the states. The role of women during the war, again, just like we're going to see in World War I and what we're going to see in World War II, women are going to go into factories in the North and take those jobs while men are away at war. They are also going to take care of the farms and grow the food during while men are at war as well. But the main thing that women are going to do during the war, if they are involved in the war, is nursing. And so as thousands and thousands of men are being killed and wounded, women are going to take care of these wounded men on the front lines. The key figure here is a woman named Clara Barton. Clara Barton is going to come up with this idea of triage, where wounded men are placed into 3 different categories: most severely wounded, people who need attention right away, and then people who can wait. And the people who can wait are obviously going to wait. The people who are the most severely wounded, we're going to put those people aside because there's no help for them, and we are going to treat the people who need medical attention right now, who can be saved but need to be attended to right away. Clara Barton is also, after the Civil War, going to be setting up the Red Cross. So that's what she's most known for. The role of African Americans during the Civil War. Frederick Douglass encourages Lincoln and pushes Lincoln to allow blacks to fight in the Civil War. The number one example of this is the 54th Massachusetts, which is the first all-black regiment to be allowed to fight in combat. And so eventually what we find is that what we're concerned about is that blacks in combat are just going to run away because obviously they're inferior to whites. But what we actually find is that blacks, because they have something to fight for, not only will volunteer to fight in the military, and most blacks who are eligible to fight do fight, but also that they fight very, very bravely, and instead of running away, they stay there in the fight. So blacks are allowed in the military. They are also paid less than whites because, again, this inequality between blacks and whites. And for the same combat roles, whites are going to be paid more than blacks. And at first, blacks are not allowed to fight, but eventually, toward the end of the Civil War, blacks are allowed to fight. Now, interestingly, by the end of the war, the United States military had more blacks fighting in the Union Army than the South had soldiers in their army. So blacks really tipped the scale for the Union to win this war. All right, let's talk about our different categories. The first one, there are three of them. The first one, number one, Texas War of Independence in 1836. Number two, the annexation of Texas to the United States in 1845. Number three, the Mexican War begins in 1846. And number four, the Compromise of 1850, obviously in 1850. The second grouping, number one, the Kansas-Nebraska Act is passed in 1854. Number two, the Know Nothing Party is formed in 1854. Number three, Bleeding Kansas begins in 1856. And number four, Dred Scott decision in 1857. The final grouping, number one, Lincoln is elected in 1860. This is November of 1860. Number two, South Carolina secedes, December of 1860. Number three, Fort Sumter is attacked in 1861. And number four, the Emancipation Proclamation is issued in 1862. It actually goes into effect in 1863. Okay, that is the end of review number 5. We are halfway done. We'll catch you next time.